Grab your Bibles. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It is great to be with you this morning. I want to welcome our guests. We're very glad that you're here this morning. Had some wonderful conversations with some of those who are visiting with us this morning. What makes you, you? That's the question I want to start off with this morning. What makes you, you? Is it the things that you do, the place that you work, the things you enjoy doing? Is that what makes you, you? What happens when you no longer have that job? When you're no longer able to do those hobbies? Do you cease to be you? So maybe tying our identity to the things that we do isn't the best idea. So what makes you, you? Well, maybe it's your physical form, your flowing hair, your wonderful complexion, your height, your weight. Well, but what happens when your metabolism changes, your hair changes, your body changes? Do you cease to be you? Okay, so maybe our physical form is not the best thing to tie our identity to either. So what makes you, you? Well, maybe it's your thoughts, your beliefs, the things that you hold dearly to. Maybe it's your memories and the things that you hold dear and think. But what happens when your thinking changes? Your beliefs change. What happens if you get something like Alzheimer's and you can't remember as well as you once did? Do you then cease to be you? The question of the self is actually a complex one, and it's a challenging one. I mentioned it last week in last week's sermon, but in the movie Inside Out 2, they deal with the idea and the concept of the self. It's an interesting idea that they play with and work with, and it really kind of comes down their definition of self to those beliefs that we tell ourselves that form our identity. Who do we say we are? Why do we believe what we believe? What are those experiences that we've had? And that's an interesting concept. But we want to kind of wrestle with this idea this morning of what makes you, you. What is the self? Who are, and what are you? I think sometimes we say, well, I am my soul. My soul, that inner part of myself, that's what makes me, me. And what we say by soul often is tied to this idea, this in Greek philosophy, of the ghost in the machine. That this physical form that eventually changes and breaks down is nothing but a shell. And that the real me is within. The real me is the ghost within that is filling that vessel. But that's really more of a Greek philosophy than anything we would find within the biblical text. The closest thing within the biblical text would be the idea of a spirit. The spirit being the breath. The idea that God, who breathed into mankind, into his nostrils, the breath of life, that spirit that came from God, that animates the body, then returns to God who gave it when we die. That's probably the closest thing to that idea of an eternal self, of who we are. So this morning we're going to wrestle with this idea a little bit. Because what we often think of as the soul, and what the Bible talks about as the soul, and what we think of as the spirit, and what the Bible talks about as spirit, maybe aren't as closely connected as we think most of the time. Now, right now we're studying the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 and 5. And this is a prayer that the Jewish people pray twice a day. It became the pledge, the call to action. So once again, I want to encourage those who are able to stand. And we're going to say this. It's up on the screen. So say it with me. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. All right, go ahead and sit down. I'm going to be the one speaking from here on out, and I am by no means divine. When we think of this idea of the soul, we often associate it with this idea of the spirit. And we think of them as very closely connected. So when we stand up, and we have for the last couple weeks, and we say the Shema, the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then Jesus said, then the second commandment is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. When we say soul, we often think that spiritual part of us, that eternal part of us, the breath. But that's not the word that's used here at all. That's not the idea in any way, shape, or form, actually. The word here for soul is the word nephesh. Nephesh. It comes from the idea of the throat. Not the breath, but the throat. It's the idea of the consciousness, of the body, of life itself. However, within this idea of a nephesh, the scripture even speaks of not only a living nephesh, but a dead nephesh. So you can have a dead soul. So the concept of a nephesh, or of a soul, is not so much of the eternal part of us, but more of actually the flesh, the animated self of who you are. That's more the idea of the nephesh, of the soul, right? Which is very different than what we think of. So when we read passages like Psalm 42, as a deer pants for streams of water, so my nephesh, my soul, for you, O Lord. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night. And while they say to me all day long, where is my God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul. How I would go with the throng and lead the procession to the house of God with glad shouts of songs of praise, with the multitude and the keeping of the festival. When we think of nephesh, this concept that David draws upon of a deer panting for streams of water. Think about the last couple of weeks and how hot it has been. You walk outside in any time after 11 o'clock, and it doesn't take long for your nephesh to be longing for a drink of water. Could you imagine a deer living outside, coming upon a stream at 2 in the afternoon, and how parched and how longing that deer is to be filled up and satisfied with a stream. And David uses this idea, and he says, so my soul, so my being longs for God. That's the idea of the nephesh, of how we are to love the Lord our God with our soul, to long to be with Him. Every bit of our living being, every bit of our physical being, every part of who we are being devoted to our God. That's the idea that is tied up in this word nephesh, of our soul, of how we love the Lord our God with everything that we are. In Psalm 119, starting in verse 173, let your hands be ready to help me, for I have chosen your precepts. I long for your salvation, O Lord, and your law is my delight. Let my soul live and praise you. Let your rules help me. I have gone astray like a sheep, and seek your servant, for I do not forget your commandments. Once again, we have this idea of this great longing, this great desire to be with God, with everything of who we are. So when we think of this idea of the soul, when we think of this idea of our nephesh, what we're thinking of is our being, all of our being, where the Spirit of God dwells, longing to be unified with Him once more. That great longing. That's the idea of the nephesh, of the soul of who we are. So we then look at what we have so far. We have the word Shema, the concept of to hear. But not just to hear, but to pay attention and to then seek to do. Because to Shema and not to seek to do is to not Shema. Shema requires action. It requires obedience. And it reminds us of who we are seeking to obey. We pay attention to the Lord our God, the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them. We love the Lord our God. An emotion tied to an action, tied to a choice, tied to devotion. A God who is worthy. So we hear the Lord our God and we choose to love Him. And we love Him with our whole heart. The heart being the whole inner self. Our emotions, our memories, our thoughts, and ultimately our choice. So we love the Lord our God with all of our heart, but we also love the Lord our God with all of our soul, with our whole being, with all of our longing. That's how we're called to love the Lord our God. And that leads directly in to the last one, to love the Lord your God with all your strength. Now, most of us, when we think of strength, we think of muscle. Right? We think of our physical strength. And there's a wonderful word in the Hebrew that means physical strength. Is that my next slide? Yes. But that's not what is being used here. Ma'od does not mean physical strength. It's actually an adverb. Now, I know we're not back in school yet. I don't like grammar, okay? Not my strong suit, but hang with me. An adverb, for those who it's been a little while, is a word that comes alongside another word to modify or augment its meaning. Simply put, it changes the intensity of the word. So ma'od, as an adverb, comes alongside and makes you very happy, or very powerful, or very good, or very angry. Ma'od is a modifier that intensifies. We see this word used a number of times within the pages of Scripture. We see the concept of very good being used in the story of creation. God saw what He had made, and He said it was not just good, He said it was ma'od good, very good. We see this concept of anger with Cain and Abel, where Cain was ma'od angry. He was very angry. We see the idea of Saul as king, who thought of himself as very powerful. Or of the people of Israel being glad that Saul was king, being very happy about it. Not just happy, but extremely happy. Right? There's another way, though, that ma'od is used. In Genesis chapter 30 and 43, verse 43, thus Jacob increased greatly and had large flocks and female servants and male servants and camels and donkeys. It's not just that the word ma'od is used once, but it's actually Jacob increased and ma'od, he increased very greatly. So the word is used back to back in order to greatly intensify. And then it goes on to explain what is meant by very great, how God has blessed him. Right? So very, very is the concept that's being used there. In Numbers chapter 14, I'm going to start verse 6. When Joshua and Caleb and those who had gone to spy out the land, they tore their clothes, and they said to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, the land to which we passed through to spy out was exceedingly good, or ma'od, good. If the Lord delighted in us, he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, of course, we know the story and the fact that they rejected Caleb and Joshua's plea. They sought to return back to Egypt, and they ended up wandering for 40 years. Right? But the concept here that Joshua and Caleb will use this word ma'od twice in order to greatly intensify what is being communicated, how greatly God has blessed them and blessed the land. With great muchness is probably the best way we can translate this word, muchness. Now that is a weird word to use, and that's why a lot of translators don't use it, because it's not good English. Right? In the same way that I'm not much of a grammar person, so too muchness wouldn't be a very good translation of that word. However, when we look at the way that the Hebrew writers translated it into Greek, we see this kind of in Jesus' words himself. In Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 29, Jesus answered and said, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. The word mind is part of what is being used here to translate this word ma'od, and the word that would have been used in the Septuagint to translate from the Greek, or from the Hebrew into the Greek. Jesus adds to it this word strength to communicate this idea of muchness, of wholeness, of everything that one is, because the idea of mind is contained within the idea of heart, as we saw last week. Right? So when we're wrestling with this concept of exactly what's being communicated, the word muchness is more what is being communicated with everything that you are. Whether it be your wealth, whether it be your physical ability, whether it be your mental ability, your soul, your spirit, everything that you are. Love the Lord your God with everything, every fiber of your being, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your strength, with everything that you are, love the Lord your God. There is no part of you that should not be devoted to the Lord your God. And that is why the people of Israel would pray this twice a day. Because it was that reminder to love the Lord your God with everything that you are. This is why it was the greatest commandment. Hands down, everyone knew it. When that teacher of the law stood up to test Jesus, and he asked that question, what's the greatest commandment? He knew the answer. Every Jew knew the answer. It's the Shema. You love the Lord your God with everything that you are. The real question is, what is the second? And Jesus said the second is the same as the first. To love the Lord your God with everything that you are is to love your neighbor as yourself. There is no way to pull those two things apart. You cannot love God who you cannot see if you do not love your neighbor who you can see. Don't tell me what your theology is. Tell me how you live, and I'll tell you what your theology is. Love the Lord your God with everything that you are, and you will love your neighbor as yourself. The Shema, then, is a pledge to be all in. All in. I'm going to love the Lord my God with all of my heart, with all of my soul, with all of my mind, with all of my muchness, with every fiber of my being, with everything and every part of who I am. I'm going to love the Lord my God. Even with my soul. Even with my spirit. I'm going to love the Lord my God with everything that I am. And that's going to lead me to obey His commandments, which is going to change the way I interact with my fellow man. It's going to change the way that I live, the way that I work, the way that I break, the way that I sleep. It's going to change everything about me. And it comes down to all those teachings of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. How do we do that? How do we love the Lord our God with everything that we are? That's what we're going to look at next week. How do we love the Lord our God with every fiber of our being? What does that look like? How do we live that out? That's what I want you to be wrestling with and thinking about. Because it's one thing to say, I'm all in. I'm going to love the Lord my God with everything that I am. But what does that look like? What does that look like? How do you do that? So the application is simple. Living it out is harder. To pay attention and to put the words of God into action, because we are listening to the Creator of the universe. And we are going to love our God with all that we are and every fiber of our being. Because He made us. And He gave us this word. And He gave us what we ought to do. The question is, will we actually do it? So the question then is, what will you do? Will you love God with every fiber of your being? Or will you not? And that's why every day the people of God for thousands of years have stood up and prayed these words to remind themselves of what they're committed to doing. So may we be a people who are committed to doing just that.